Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. And welcome to our very loyal audience, and a special welcome to our guests tonight, two extraordinary analysts, Bill Kristol and Sarah Longwell. We look forward to what will surely be a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you both for joining us, and thank everybody for being here tonight. America at a Crossroads is a joint venture between Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. Thanks as always to our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine, Xavier Oslovsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lair, and myself. Next week, we are excited to present Ambassador Norm Eisen. Don't be confused. Michael McFaul was our originally scheduled speaker for next week, but he's been called away. So join us as Norm Eisen, who's a CNN analyst, presidential ethics czar, ambassador to Prague, impeachment #1 counsel, and author and ethics and government advocate. He'll be very interesting, and he'll be in conversation with Larry Mantle on a topic entitled From Ukraine to January 6th to Top Secret Documents, a Democracy Expert's Analysis. The Wednesday after Labor Day, we welcome former Acting Solicitor General of the United States, the brilliant Neil Katyal, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post journalist Carol Leonig. There are not two more brilliant and informed people, other than maybe who we have tonight, who can discuss the future of our democracy and help us understand what's at risk. Thank you all for your donations, which keep us afloat and enable us to bring these programs to you. Just so you know, David and I and everybody else involved in putting these programs on are all volunteers. We have no staff, so your money is solely used to present these programs, and we are most appreciative. Now I would like to produce my friend and colleague, the terrific David Lair. David?
The wonderful Janice Kameneresnik, thank you. It's great to be here with one of our favorite guests, Bill Kristol. More on Bill in a minute. Janice mentioned two upcoming programs. I'd like to note a couple of others on our agenda. On September 14th, we host Cecile Richards, the former head of National Planned Parenthood, to discuss today's very real threats to reproductive rights with the LA Times Pulitzer Prize-winning Pat Morrison. Richards is the daughter of the legendary former governor of Texas, Ann Richards. The following week, we host Lawrence Tribe, one of the leading minds in American jurisprudence, who will discuss the active threats to our democratic institutions. He'll be in conversation with UC Irvine law professor and former LA Times journalist, Henry Weinstein. As I mentioned, tonight's discussion will be led by Bill Kristol, a man who has been described as, quote, the intellectual Brahmin of the modern conservative movement. He's been a regular commentator on ABC's This Week, a columnist for the New York Times, a regular on CNN and MSNBC, as well as the founder of the Weekly Standard and the editor-at-large of The Bulwark. That's quite a resume, and those are just a few of his accomplishments. For those of you who enjoy our programs, his twice monthly video podcasts with serious thinkers and newsmakers, Conversations with Bill Kristol, are worth watching. They are masterful and illuminating interviews. And tonight we have Bill here in person to work his magic. Bill, the program's all yours.
Thanks, David. Janice, it's great to be back with you, both of you, and with all of you on what are we on here? On Zoom, I guess, right? So it's great to see you all. And it's really great to have my colleague, Sarah Longwell, with us. You'll very much enjoy, she hasn't done one of these yet. And so once you see her for an hour, I can just kind of retire and slink off into the sunset, and Sarah can replace me as the regular face. But I could give Sarah a long introduction. We worked together very closely the last 4 years. She's been the key person in building up Defending Democracy Together, which in turn has spawned Republican Voters Against Trump and many other efforts, including we'll talk about what we're doing this year. She's also the publisher of The Bulwark, the website that was started when the Weekly Standard folded, has been key to its success. So yeah, really remarkable achievement over the last 4 years. Maybe the best place to begin, Sarah, though, you and I met, I think, only in 2017. It's hard to believe, actually. And you were, of course, active and prominent in Washington before that. But how did this come about? I think people would be interested just in a little bit of the backstory of why you're now getting profiled in the New Yorker and appearing on TV, and the Focus Group podcast is doing so well and all that.
Well, you know as well as I that I was not particularly prominent back in 2017. I had spent years on the right. I was a senior vice president at kind of a standard Republican PR firm. But when Donald Trump got elected, I was at the time, I was also the first female board chair of the Log Cabin Republicans. So it was the LGBT Republican group. And they had really wanted to endorse Donald Trump. And I was staunchly opposed to that. And after he won, I sort of went, everybody in our world was never Trump before Trump got elected. And it's hard to think back to this, but everybody at the National Review and all the publications, everybody was kind of never Trump together there in DC. But after Trump won, that number dwindled dramatically. Most people decided to just get on board. And so I wanted to figure out what could we do? Was there something to be done to push back against Donald Trump and the capture of the Republican Party? And there was this meeting that used to take place. It was called the Meeting of the Concerned. And I would always call it the Sad Republicans meeting. That is where I met Bill. Bill was in the room. There was a bunch of sad Republicans. We would get together every week. And I sort of cornered Bill.
This is 2017, right?
Yeah. This is 2017. And I ended up cornering Bill and saying, you're Bill Kristol, you're famous. We should do something. We should primary Trump. We should try to understand these voters. And that led to many coffees and ultimately us starting an organization together, defending democracy together. But most importantly, it led to our scheming of any way that we could defeat Trump. And one of the things that we needed to do that, we were thinking about, well, could we primary Donald Trump? And we were, this is public information, though not necessarily super well known. We were out there talking to Larry Hogan. But one of the things that about primary Trump. But one of the things that sort of everybody wondered was, how strong was Trump's grip on the party? We ask this question still today, but at the time it was like, could he be primaried? And so we started doing focus groups, talking to Republican voters. And this was a game changer for me, because this is when I realized why Trump had gotten elected, why Republican voters were responding to him in a way that those of us who sort of were in the DC think tank conservative community, who were like limited governments, free markets, American leadership in the world, that is not how these Republican voters were thinking about Trump. And they really they hated Hillary Clinton. They wanted somebody to disrupt things in a major way. They saw him as a businessman. They felt like they knew him because of The Apprentice. But it was so grounding to listen to actual voters that it became the centerpiece to how I began to think about everything. You remember those early days, and we would travel to New Hampshire to do them. Now we do them absolutely every week. I've been doing them almost every week now for a few years. And so I've been able to really see the trends of how voters are moving. I've been able to, I think, really excavate what is going on with Republican voters and how the party is changing. We can get into all that, but I would say that all of the audience research I've done began with me meeting Bill Kristol in that room and us thinking about whether or not there was a way to take on Trump.
Sarah's the focus group aficionado and expert, not me. I get too depressed watching them and we're agitated, and you have to be, of course, to be a moderator, you can't be correcting them all the time and so forth. So we're chastising them. So, but Sarah, you had done focus groups in the business, I guess, before then, but you hit upon that as a particularly useful way, I think, to get outside the bubble and get the kind of granularity you don't get in polls. But maybe people don't know. Say a word about like just how does a focus group work? I mean, now you do them virtually mostly. So, but yeah.
Yeah. So
how do you find these people? How do you,
Sure.
how do you know they're what, how do they, are they representative of anything? What's the point of it? How do you do it?
Yeah, so there are focus group facilities all over the country, and we used to go to them, and you'd sit behind the glass, and somebody would order you Chinese food, and you'd eat M&Ms, and you'd have a moderator who would be sitting there, the two-way glass, and the moderator would be sitting in the room with 12 people, just asking them what they thought. And the people are curated. So when you are trying to pick your group, you say, a lot of what we were doing back in 2017, 2018 was, I would like to talk to Republican voters who think Donald Trump is doing a very bad job, because we viewed that as the persuadable category. And so the focus group facilities would go out to their lists, and they do focus groups on all kinds of things. Hey, there's a new menu at the Chili's, have people look at it and tell you if they like it. They don't just do politics. In fact, most of what they do aren't politics. And so, but they have all this information about people. And so you're able to figure out who did people vote for? And then they'll answer a survey that says, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do they feel about XYZ? So you're able to say, okay, these are my persuadable bucket of voters. And back in 2020, the first organization or the first project Bill and I launched together was Republicans for the Rule of Law during the Mueller investigation. But during 2020, we were like, okay, we got to beat Trump. And one of the things we were particularly interested in were these swing voters, people who were, they were Republicans, sort of moderate Republicans or right-leaning independents. Maybe they'd voted for Trump because they had just disliked the Clintons for so long, but they weren't happy with Trump at all. And so we wanted to figure out, how do you get to these people? How do you make them vote for a Democrat, which is not something they're inclined to do? And one of the things that we were doing early on is we were doing a lot of ads, just kind of really pounding on Trump. I would say, if you're familiar with what the Lincoln Project did later on, that was kind of what we had started doing like a year earlier, and they would go viral on Twitter. But when we were testing them with the swing voters, they were not landing. Like the swing voters, they didn't like Trump themselves, but they thought all of the ways that people were banging on Trump, it just didn't resonate with them. It just shut them down. And so we started experimenting with a new type of thing. We basically, I had seen somebody else running a campaign with just regular people on their phones. And I said, I wonder if we could do that with Republican voters who are going to refuse to vote for Trump. And so we got a bunch of prototypes of people who said, hey, I've been a Republican my entire life, but I don't want to vote. I'm not going to vote for Trump in 2016. And I'm actually going to vote for Joe Biden. He's fine. We started piloting those. And from a persuasion standpoint with the swing voters, it hit them totally differently because, like I said, my background's in communications. And one of the number one things you're trying to do with any communication campaign is you're trying to not persuade people always. You are trying to give them permission to do something that they already kind of want to do, but they don't quite know how to cross some kind of Rubicon. And in this case, that Rubicon is, I don't usually vote for Democrats. I don't actually like many of their policies, but gosh, I dislike this Trump guy so much. And so by having regular people saying, hey, I'm Tommy from Texas and I'm pro-life and I voted for Trump in 2016, but I will not vote for him again in 2020 because he's a terrible person, XYZ. That was what landed with people. That's what created the permission structure for them. And using the focus groups to really suss out what was the message that was going to resonate with these swing voters, because that's what my head's in all the time. What do the swing voters think? The people who are going to make the difference in an election. And if you look at 2020, at the end of the day, both sides turned out absolutely everybody they could. And it came down to that sort of 4% of right-leaning independents, moderate Republicans, who, even if they voted for Republicans down ticket, they voted for Joe Biden. And in those swing states, that was the critical margin. And so I know that's like a long answer to your question.
No, it's great. Yeah. No, I mean, it's true. Look, and without patting ourselves on the back, and obviously a lot of things went into this, and not just us, but in Wisconsin, to take one state that was crucial, Republicans down ballot total, you add up all the House races, got more votes than the Democrats, but Biden beat Trump. So there were X number of voters who I think responded very much to our message of, hey, I'm a Republican, and some of them would even say on the videos, on the testimonials, I'm going to stick with the party down ballot. People like you and me, I think we're not maybe quite, that's not where we are, but you know what? This is why they're doing the testimonial, not us, right? And I'm going to stick with the party down ballot. I like the local Republicans, but we just can't vote for Trump. Can't have another 4 years of Trump. It's too dangerous. And Trump lost to Biden in Wisconsin, though the Republican Party got more votes than the Democratic Party at the congressional level and state legislative level in Wisconsin. So I do think it worked. The permission structure, I don't know that that's a term I'd ever heard before. I was working with you in 2018, 19. And I would say a word more about it. It's such an interesting, it's just a kind of communications, strategy question. Say a word about where that comes from and how that works. I mean, I think in reality.
I mean, look, at the end of the day, politics is just about people. And in a lot of ways, it's about tribes. It's gotten, you hear a bit people talking about it, tribalism now. It used to be, could be tribes in kind of a friendly way. Like there's good things about tribes. We're built, prehistorically, like preternaturally, to have some tribalism. The problem is that, the negative polarization now is such where people, and this was all over the focus groups, people know less about what they're for. They know a lot about what they're against. And so that solidifies them on a team. And so when you're thinking about permission that's right, where you're trying to do persuasion permission. And when you're doing that, you almost had to think about it like, well, how do I build another tribe? And so the permission structure was really, there's a lot of people to whom their identity as a Republican matters to them. And because it's part of their identity, getting them to do a thing that conflicts with that identity isn't easy. And it's why it's so sort of reflexively, like people are like, well, how could anybody vote for Donald Trump? And I really understand this, but you listen to voters and it's like, I've been a Republican my whole life. My parents are Republicans. I hate Hillary Clinton. I voted for Donald Trump. Like I didn't think that hard about it. And that's not everybody, but it's a lot of people. And so you had to give people an ability to retain their identity as a Republican, but do a different thing. And so that's why having a bunch, there's a lot of phrases around this that sort of signal psychologically what's going on here, like safety in numbers, right? People don't like to be out on a limb by themselves. But if you created this sense, Republican voters against Trump, you plant a flag that allows people to say, yeah, look, I'm still a Republican. And then the thing was, one of the things that was interesting to me about our program is that we sort of had to grind to get the first 100. We had to like email our lists of people who had signed up for our programs and say, hey, will you make one of these videos? But when we came out with the first 100, 1,000 came back to us because people were like, I understand this. These are my people. I am one of these people. And all we had to do was put it in the world for it to come back to us, because people were looking for that sense of community. And so a lot of times when I think about persuasion and permission structures too, I think about, how do you build a sense of community or a faction within some kind of existing community? And that's what we did.
Yeah, and I think Sarah's being modest maybe and not making it sound like, well, just find these people. I mean, it is one reason why doesn't everyone do this? It's not like this is a unique insight. People do have an understanding that they don't do it, because it's very hard it takes a lot of some money and a lot of time and a lot of just grunt work of we had some terrific young staffers and interns, but I mean, to find, you have to have this way to find the kind of type. How do you find people in Pennsylvania who are former Trump voters or former Republicans or still Republicans who are inclined to be opposed to Trump in 2020? You need to go search. You have to, in a way, search, do a lot of programs and emails, and I get them to respond to your emails and sign up for things, and then be in touch with them. And of course, a lot of them say, well, that's, I'm with you, I sympathize with you, but I don't want to do a testimonial. I mean, people get mad at me, and it's kind of risky. I don't do that kind of thing. So persuading them in a gentle way, and then helping them do them, though they're very authentic. Those are really those people talking. We did very little editing really on them, and no editing almost, except for taking away, I don't know, parts where they making it shorter sometimes. But so it's a hard thing practically to do. People don't appreciate it. We keep running into people, you and I laugh about this all the time. Hey, I want to do what you guys did in 2020. I'm going to do it in 2022. I've got, $1 million. I got a donor. I just want to do it here in whatever state I'm in. So how do I do it? Well, you need to find these people, and that takes a while. It takes time. So it was a real management challenge, I think, which of course the pandemic then hit. And so the whole thing was kind of amazing that we pulled it off. You pulled it off really. And just 2 years was really got going, a year and a half really, right? And when did we start building up the list? I guess with the Republicans for the rule of law,
Yeah, that's right. I mean, just logistically really quickly, I mean, the main thing that we had to do was plant a flag, right? This was one of the things that was important to us early, was we had to be public about the fact that we were Republicans and we were going to oppose Trump. And we were going to protect the Mueller investigation from political interference. We're going to run ads about that. We were going to spend money on it. And that allowed us to say, here we are, come find us. And we would do
sign this petition.
It's called acquisition. Yeah, it's called digital acquisition. And that's how we built these big lists. And we built a relationship with people. And this is why you can't just pop up groups out of nowhere, because ultimately to get people to do a thing, like make a video about what's important to them and put it on the internet, they got to trust you. And they got to trust you and the rest of the community that's doing it. And so building that trust was honestly the biggest thing. And that required lots of conversations with a lot of people. Yeah. But we learned a lot through that. And I think authenticity, this is a thing, and you're going to talk to lots of people and they do political advertising. But whenever it comes to candidates, when it comes to ideas, when it comes to persuasion or permission campaigns, authenticity is the number one thing. People are very aware when they're being worked. And so, when you ask people like, who do you trust? And this is something that, again, comes through in the focus groups. It's a lot of trust. The erosion of trust now is like one of the fundamental breaking points, like in our culture, in our society. And so, building, and so when you ask people like, who do you trust? The number one answer is people like me. Not me, Sarah, not you, but like people like them. So somebody who just like seems normal like them, so they don't feel like they're getting worked. And that's the essential piece of the campaign. It's why it's effective.
So let's talk about, well, and incidentally, everyone should listen to your podcast, The Focus Group, which is every week, Focus Group, and different guests analyzing focus groups in different states, sometimes of Trump supporters, sometimes of swing voters, depending on what you're trying to figure out in some of these different states about what's going on in these different races. Right now, we're focused on defeating some of the election deniers and some of the key races for governor, secretary of state, and a couple of the particularly bad Trumpy Senate candidates. You're doing these focus groups every week. What have everyone's, I think people who watch on this podcast, on this live stream are knowledgeable of politics. They're probably following the primaries the way we are. But what have you, what have you seen? What would you tell people about the mood of the electorate? What's working as an appeal? What isn't working as an appeal? What struck you? What surprised you over the last few months? And then we can get into a little more detail, maybe, and talk about Liz Cheney and last night's primaries. But I'm just, you've really had a granular sense of this, I think, much more than some of us who are just looking at the public opinion polls whenever they come out.
Yeah, I think just at a macro level, the biggest thing that's interesting to me right now is watching this shift in real time from where we were, let's say last fall, where when reporters would call me and be like, what are you hearing in your focus groups? And I would say, there's a devastating enthusiasm gap between the Republicans and the Democrats. And this really, we were focus grouping a lot going into the Virginia race between Youngkin and McAuliffe. We focus grouped a bunch after the race to understand kind of the Biden-Youngkin voters, of which they were many, because we're very interested in these swing voters and why they're, why they think what they do. And the way that I would always describe the groups back then was, you talk to a Republican group and they were like, couldn't wait to vote for any living, breathing Republican. They were mad about COVID. Inflation was just starting to get big. They were mad about these education issues, and they just, and all of there was like the Trump revenge tour. They believed that the election was stolen, and they couldn't wait to get out and vote against Democrats. And the Democratic groups were like, my scientific term for it was like, meh. Like, they were down on Biden. They didn't feel like Democrats were doing anything. And even though it was like just months after an insurrection, it was that the Republicans, like after trying to overturn an election, Republicans were they were amped up, and the Democrats were totally demoralized. And so I was trying to explain to people about this enthusiasm gap that I was seeing. And then, and a lot of these swing voters that we were very focused on, they were the Youngkin voters, right? They were people who'd voted for Biden, and then they went and voted for Youngkin. They did not think he was Trump-like. They were happy to vote for him. They were mad about COVID. And this was the thing back then. If you just even go back a year or less than a year, there was a real anger about the restrictions on COVID continuing to go on when people felt like they should be done. And the school was like at the center of it. The disruption around school had a lot of these suburban swing voters, just the kids with the having to still wear masks, or schools being shut down intermittently, or the rules around, if you had an exposure and then you had to leave, like it was making parents crazy. And so that really, really helped Youngkin. So that's nine months ago, huge enthusiasm gap to today, where the enthusiasm now is much more on the Democratic side, and it's a combination of a bunch of things. One is obviously Roe, and we can dig into that, the Dobbs decision. And Bill was actually somebody who was always saying to me, I think if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, that you are going to see just a total dynamic shift in the electorate. And I was pretty skeptical that was true, because I was talking to voters, and like, Inflation was 100% all they talked about. It was inflation, it was gas prices, it was supply chain. People were so frustrated. You would ask them how they thought things were going in the country. They thought they were terrible. And that wasn't just Republicans, it was everybody. Where am I going with this? Oh, so Roe, but so it's the Roe decision. It really did. So as much as I was skeptical, but like once it actually happened, it really did change. I mean, and it's not just women, it's men, it's swing voters. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is the candidates. And this is the piece that people are missing a little bit. Because everyone's like abortion, that's what's doing it, and a little bit guns and a little bit the January 6th committee. All true, all part of the mix. But the other thing that has happened is that the primaries are ending and that voters now know what their choices are. And this is the thing. We have moved from it being a referendum on the Democrats, which is where we were 6 months ago. Referendum on Biden, Biden's in the mid-30s. It's bad if it's a referendum on Democrats. Now it's a choice election. It has moved to a choice election, not just because of Roe. It works on two levels, both because of Roe, but also because of the choice now with the Republican candidates that Donald Trump has gone around anointing and picking. They are election deniers to a person. They are wildly outside the mainstream on abortion. I don't think that people quite anticipated that it wasn't just that Doug Mastriano, who is running for governor of Pennsylvania, or who's the GOP nominee for Pennsylvania, it's not just that he was at January 6th. It's not just that he used campaign funds to bus people to January 6th. He also believes in zero exceptions for abortion, rape, incest, life of the mother. And he's at one of the most uncompromising positions on abortion. The governors are the ones who are going to decide this. And so the candidate quality, and we can run through them quickly, but Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, Carrie Lake in Arizona, who's running for governor, who is a TV personality, a news personality there, big election denier, just repeats everything that Trump says. Tim Michaels in Wisconsin, Tudor Dixon in Michigan. You've now got all these swing state governors who matter a great deal to us because we've been thinking about it through a democracy lens, who is going to certify elections, and the governors and secretary of state matter a great deal. But now they also, but democracy can be a little bit of a niche issue. But when you add the democracy to the abortion issue, which is a much more broad mainstream issue, you've created, what's happened is that Democrats have closed the enthusiasm gap, because now Democrats are fired up about Roe, and they're looking, and then swing voters are looking at these candidates. And one of the things that I was saying, 9 months ago is, Trump is on the ballot for the people that he attracts, the people who love Trump and think that the election was stolen from them. They want to go out and vote because of Trump, but he's not on the ballot for the people that he repels, these swing voters. He is on the ballot now. Like, he has put himself on the ballot, both by who he has put his hands on to nominate and sort of handpick in these primaries, and also the fact that they themselves are very, very Trumpy, right? They're all about election denialism and kooky stuff. And so I think that is a big part of the dynamic shift that I've seen.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it's ironic in a way that the extremism of the Republicans, which I think has now come through in these individual states, and it's come through partly because we and others have done a lot of ads, highlighting their extremism, but they do a pretty good job highlighting it themselves in a lot of cases. And they won most of the key primaries, which might not have happened, would be in a different circumstance probably then. But I also feel, I do find this, that it sort of spills over. Once you have 5 extreme gubernatorial candidates, the whole party in major states, the whole party gets a feel of being, it's just like there are a lot of kooks in that party, and people don't really like, if you're a swing voter at least, a party that's extreme and kooky. And the Democrats paid an unfair price, honestly, probably, for a few, people screaming to fund the police in summer of 2020, and the Republicans at Fox News and everyone very effectively put that label on other Democrats who didn't believe that, but who hadn't distanced themselves aggressively from it or whatever. It does feel like now it's the Republicans. It's a little hard to shake that extremism label, especially when they have candidates who are proudly kind of talking about how they're Christian nationalists and, going on, intensifying the election denial. The Republican nominee for AG in Texas today, I just saw this about an hour before we came on, put out an opinion which basically could really throw the whole electoral system in Texas into total disarray. Any citizen can go and request to see the ballots like a day or two after the election. And, it's just an invitation to all those characters who already caused enough trouble in 2020 in Arizona and everywhere to just go totally berserk and intimidate, local election officials if it's a close race, which could be for AG. So I do feel like the extremism thing is really hit in a way that it's ironic because, and I want you to say a word about January 6th, then we'll talk about Liz Cheney and get to the kind of more the current moment. I mean, I'd say you and I, it was shocking how little price the Republicans paid for January 6th and for what Trump did and for their own refusal to deal with what Trump did. And then they're turning against the whole January 6th committee and we don't even want to know about it. It's like we just had this attempted insurrection, an attempted coup, but God forbid we should actually find out what happened. So we won't have a bipartisan committee. I mean, I was really down in the dumps at the end of last year thinking, what is going on? But in a funny way, it's come back in a slightly different form today. So maybe one should be a little more cheerful. I don't know. You were surprised, weren't you, too, though, that January 6th did not. I mean, if you were coming down from Mars in October, looking at the electorate, would it have mattered? January 6th didn't matter, right?
January 6th did not matter. And no, it was, look, I think all of us were sitting there that day. And I remember talking to somebody who said to me, this is really awful, but I slept okay that night because I knew Donald Trump could never come back from this, right? But what happened, and this goes to one of the reasons I've never been able to quit the focus groups is because us in Washington, you watch something like that and you think, well, he's done. Nobody can support him after this. But doing the focus groups allows me to listen to people and who immediately find rationalizations. It got a little out of control, but what about all the Black Lives Matter protests? Why aren't those people in jail? Why is it when Republicans do it? You know who that actually was who was storming the Capitol? That was Antifa. That was Black Lives Matter. That wasn't Trump people. It's just to make Trump look bad. And so that, I'm sure to many people sounds very crazy, but one of the essential differences in our politics today is that we live in bifurcated information silos. And so there's a feedback loop, a very toxic feedback loop between, I always call it the Republican triangle of doom, between sort of the Republican infotainment media, the voters, and the elected officials. And so the elected officials, if you go back, you look at what McCarthy was saying, you certainly look at what Mitch McConnell was saying, they were condemning Trump, saying that he was responsible for the attack that day. And then they started hearing from, the Steve Bannon type started to churn, the voters started to churn, and enough of them freaked out the politicians that they were going to hold it against them, not against Trump, that the politicians, Kevin McCarthy scurries down to Mar-a-Lago to make things right with Trump. And once Kevin McCarthy says, oh, Trump's fine, well, that gives permission to a whole other slice of the party to be like, I guess this is fine. We're moving on from this. And before you know it, the entire party has told itself a story where, well, look, people were upset. The election was stolen from them. One of the things I talk about democracy a lot, and one of the things I always try to point out to people to give them some sense of where voters are is that if you do a poll of Republicans, Democrats, and independents and ask them, do you think democracy is under attack? Get 48% of Democrats, 51% of independents, 77% of Republicans. It is the Republicans who believe that democracy is under attack because they believe an election was stolen. It is grounding to be able to listen to people. I ask them all the time. So, okay, you believe the election was stolen, why? And they say, well, I went to bed that night of the election. Donald Trump was winning. And then I woke up and Joe Biden was winning. How do you explain that? And you say, well, they kept counting votes. That is they don't know why. It's just a feeling that they have that something fishy went on. They have lost faith in our institutions. And this is why the January 6th committee ended up being so important for this, because they really pushed back on that. And one of the most interesting things that has happened recently in the focus groups was after the January 6th committee started, prior to the January 6th committee, in every focus group of Republican voters, Trump voters, you'd say, how many of you want to see Donald Trump run again for president in 2024? Usually half the group or more, but like always half the group. After the January 6th committee started, we had a bunch of groups and nobody wanted Trump to run again. And we were like, well, it can't be. They weren't sitting down and watching the hearings. So we were kind of like, what's going on here? And the way I would describe it is it was less of a breaking through, that the January 6th committee hearings were breaking through and changing people's minds. They were seeping in. And Republican voters were not walking away from Trump. They were not saying that they, disavowing him or that it was his fault January 6th. But they were starting to think that he might not be very electable. Like they were starting to say, I don't know, maybe we should do DeSantis. Maybe we should go with somebody else. Donald Trump, I think he's got too much baggage. And I think the January 6th committee has done a lot to start to shape bigger picture narratives for people that like Trump just might not be the guy going forward. And so I've seen a real shift around that. But I would also caution, Donald Trump has an iron-like grip on the base of the Republican Party. And that base is pretty big. It's big enough that he's getting his way in just about every Republican primary.
And the 10 impeachers in the House, 8 of them won't be back, and maybe one other might have a tough general election, actually. So, and Liz Cheney, of course, most famously. I mean, we should talk about that. I would just add one thing. I think people underestimate how important a lot of the questions that have come in are sensible. How could people believe this? Why did they believe it? There's so much evidence that's not true. But if every senior Republican had made it his business from November 3rd to say, or December 14th, certainly, let's say the election was not stolen, this has been done correctly, Trump should be quiet, it's irresponsible what he and his minions are saying. And if you're a Republican, if you're the governor you voted for, the senator you voted for, the member of Congress you voted for, keep saying that over and over. Not all, some of them would have stuck with Trump, no question. But I think a key delta of voters would have said, no, it's a little crazy, I guess. I mean, I voted for these Republicans and they were for Trump and they're saying it's over. The silence of the establishment of the sort of normal Republican officials was almost as damaging as the cheerleading of the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, I think, and the acquiescence or the non-challenging of Trump by the conservative establishment media and so forth, I think was almost as damaging for certain swath of voters. Made it harder to fight back. It made everyone, so they're looking around and no one's telling them they're wrong. And then people are feeding all this misinformation and disinformation. And the only people who are challenging it, they seem to think, are the Democrats, who obviously have an interest in challenging it. So I think it was a terrible failure, I think, of the Republican establishment and the conservative establishment in a moment where they really could have done good for the country and saved us from being in the dangerous moment we're in now, but we're in it. So anyway, Liz Cheney, you mentioned the January 6th committee, pretty impressive performance, I think you would agree, by her, and courageous and admirable and very rare really in modern politics. On the other hand, she got clobbered in Wyoming. On the third hand, she got she got votes, right? I mean, people forget she only got probably 20% of the Republican votes. On the other hand, if 10% of the Republicans in Pennsylvania look at Liz Cheney, or have half the number who voted for Wyoming, and say, look, I admire that Cheney's a conservative Republican, he was with Bush, and she's a tough cookie, and she says it was fair. Do you think it's a bit of a permission structure there too, that she was so central to the hearing in sort of legitimizing the notion that it is a lie and it can't be accepted? Yeah,
so Liz Cheney's influence on the January 6th committee and its success cannot be overstated. Not just because she herself provides a certain kind of permission structure, even for independents, but also because Liz Cheney understands permission structures herself. And so she made sure that this hearing featured not speeches by people on the dais, but a bunch of people who worked for Trump, a bunch of people who were Trump loyalists, that they were the ones who were going to give testimony. And she understood that the credibility, couldn't be challenged. Nobody was going to say, I mean, they can say, this lawyer or that lawyer or Ivanka, the Ivanka Trump or whatever, they can impugn them, but, this is their words. They've got them on tape. And so to me, what is a marvel about the January 6th committee is just how well organized they have been. Their emergency ones, even incredibly well organized. And yeah, they've just put forward a bunch of Republicans, and so it's been the Trump people have had an impossible time. I mean, he's so glad he got the search at Mar-a-Lago, because they are dreading these January 6 hearings coming back in September, and partly because high level narratives are what you're after going into an election. And again, when you talk about the shift that I've seen, some of it was, 8 months ago, all people wanted to talk about was Joe Biden, his low approval numbers, inflation, whatever. The January 6th committee forced people to look at something else. It forced them to look at Trump and his culpability, and it began to create, it just took a little bit of the heat. And as gas prices came down, people could kind of start saying like, oh yeah, that was terrible what happened. And oh my gosh, can you believe he did this? And look at all of these surprising witnesses. And it did help sort of shift, I think, the dynamic for people at that, just in terms of like, what's the media talking about? Because if it's just inflation and Biden's doing bad, that is bad for Democrats. People talking about how Trump, that the election wasn't stolen and that Trump incited an insurrection, that's good for Democrats.
And as you say, I put Trump on the ballot. Biden's a little bit on the ballot. Can't help but be if you're the incumbent president, but there's been more decoupling. It's really remarkable. It's a political science matter. How different now the congressional generic ballot is, 50-50-ish right now. We're seeing it in special elections where Democrats are pretty much doing better even than Biden did last time, or better, or than Democrats did when they won the national popular vote for the House by 3% last time. And Biden still might, he's improved a bit, but he's minus 15. That's typically, and people, it may still happen, the presidential disapproval drags down the party, and that might happen in the last 2 months here. But I think you and I talked about this 3-4 months ago, the difference, the decoupling of the two trends, and they were on the same polls. It's not like, where the same people were being asked in one poll, do you approve or disapprove of Biden, disapprove, who you plan to vote for? Not sure, maybe Democrat though, because the Republicans too extreme. So, and in the most recent poll, it was interesting in Pew, it was about the same number of people disapproved of Biden strongly, and approved of Biden. So that's, that was sort of a wash, as it were. Democrats were a little bit ahead in the generic because some of the disapprovers of Biden, the weak disapprovers, I'm not strongly disapproving of him, but I'm more or less disapproving of him, somewhat disapproving of him. They were planning by 45 to 30, I think it was, something like that, to vote Democratic. So you have mild Biden disapprovers, but most, not overwhelmingly, not 80-20, but, tending towards the Democrats. And that's got to be about the Republican extremism, and also about that, Democrats look a little more competent and so forth. So it's it's an unusual dynamic. I mean, I guess I'll say one other thing, then ask you how much you think that's going to continue, because that would be a very unusual off-year election, but of course it's an unusual moment. I would say one thing, since we have California Democrats here as our host, I mean, Nancy Pelosi, the California Democrat, the whole Liz Cheney thing doesn't happen without her making it happen. I mean, Liz Cheney made it happen, and she was willing to be on the committee and willing to serve as vice chair, and then put an incredible amount of work in, and has made it, I think, the more important, more than any other single person, made it the successful committee that it has been. But Nancy Pelosi had to overcome a lot of Democratic grumbling behind the scenes. Like, why is Liz Cheney the vice chair of this? I mean, she wasn't for impeachment the first time, and she sort of supported Trump, frankly, in the first term, grudgingly. And she's kind of a latecomer to this. And Adam Schiff and, Jamie Raskin were pretty impressive, in the first impeachment, and as members of Congress challenging Trump. And how come they are, and I'm not saying they complained, but I'm sure people on their behalf were sort of like, shouldn't they be more prominent? And Pelosi just made that same, this decision that's a cousin to the decision you're talking about. Cheney made the decision to have all Republican witnesses. Pelosi made the decision, it's Cheney's committee, basically. And people haven't appreciated how unusual, how many times that happened? A Democratic Speaker of the House has made a Republican who was not, not like a moderate Republican who was already buddies with her or anything like that. A moderate Republican who was a pretty partisan Republican, honestly, and pretty conservative, the face of this very important committee. And but it really made the difference, I think. If it had just been a normal committee, and I like the impeachment managers in both impeachments, they were very effective and impressive, I thought, but they didn't ultimately move swing voters the way Cheney was able to, I don't think. So
Yeah, it
Pelosi
really
wants to
did cost her. I mean, the reason she lost by such a sort of catastrophic margin is that she's put herself front and center. And, when I talk about Trump having this iron grip on these base voters, a disproportionate number of those base voters live in Wyoming.
Right.
And she knew what doing that was going to do. And she just made a different decision. And I think, look, if you're people like Bill and I, who have spent the last sort of 5 or 6 years in this kind of weird wilderness place, feeling like you're saying, I cannot believe this is happening. Why isn't anybody just saying, the emperor has no clothes, telling the truth? To have Liz Cheney uncompromisingly say over and over again what the truth is, to say it on stage at a Wyoming debate, to say it to Republicans to their face, has been like water in the desert. It really is spectacular to watch. I just will say really quickly on one point, on these swing voters, since we're really focused on swing voters for this conversation, take a state like Pennsylvania, where you've got Doug Mastriano, insurrectionist, but to this question about Biden and Biden's unpopularity. So when I talk to swing voters, this dynamic is all over the place. They are not happy with Biden. They do not think he is doing a good job. It started, there was this, if you go back, there was this, the Afghanistan pullout and the Delta resurgence happened right around the same time. And that's when you watch Biden's numbers fall off a cliff.
COVID Delta, right?
Yeah, COVID, the Delta variant. And the reason you haven't seen that recover is this is just a fact. Democrats, independents, I mean, Republicans, of course, don't like him. Republicans think he has dementia, but like, people think he is too old for the job, and they think somebody else needs to be in there. But if you ask those swing voters, they will tell you they're upset about inflation. They'll tell you they're upset about gas prices. They don't like Biden. That's not even that they don't like him. They're done with him. They don't think he's doing a good job. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, he's a nice guy. But then you say to them, you're going to vote for Doug Mastriano. And they are like, under no circumstances would I vote for Doug Mastriano. Like, and if you give them a normie Democrat, like Josh Shapiro is, they're fine. Yes. I mean, the races that I'm most, I don't know, concerned about, or I think sort of disappointed, is like, you take a place like Wisconsin, swing voters, they hate Ron Johnson. Like, Ron Johnson's support is so soft. He's totally beatable, even in a bad environment. Mandela Barnes, who's got a real activist past, defund the police, abolish ICE. That's a bad fit, for Wisconsin. Right now, swing voters kind of like him, but I want to say one thing, that right now, I think Democrats are really starting to feel optimistic, right? We had the special election last night, New York 19. Everybody thought the Republican was going to pick that up. You've got this guy, Pat Ryan. He comes through, wins by like almost 3 points. People are starting to feel like the abortion issue has just really put the wind in the sails of Democrats. These candidates on the Republican side are so terrible that you've got, JD Vance running behind in Ohio. Wow, that seems crazy. The one thing I want to impress upon people, though, is that Democrats have been running their ads basically unopposed most of the summer, and they've had all the free publicity of the January 6th hearings. The Republicans are about to start spending. As soon as we come out of Labor Day, they're going to drop, it's 28 million they're going to drop in Ohio. That's going to make a difference. It's going to make a difference. And I think that to keep it competitive and to win in some of these places, like, Democrats are going to have to keep pushing on, you need the January 6th hearings going. You need to be talking about abortion, and people need to keep pushing money into these races, because Republicans have been holding their fire and they're about to do it. And it is going to shift the dynamic.
The Democrats have been pretty good at, producing pretty normal or centrist candidates in a lot of these states, not every case, as you say, a little riskier in Wisconsin, probably. So it'd be interesting to see how much the advertising, it'll certainly make a difference. How much of a difference, we don't know, and how much they can really damage scared swing voters back from those Democrats. So let's just quickly, we've got about 10 minutes. So 2022, if you want to say a word, a prediction, I covered it already a fair amount, but I'm very interested in what you said about Biden. 23 Democratic nominee 2024, or Democratic dynamics of 23-24, and Republican dynamics of 23-24. What should people be looking for?
You mean in terms of whether Biden runs again?
Yeah, will he run? Should he run? If you were, as a well-wisher to, I take it, a centrist Democrat winning perhaps in 24, since I think we've kind of given up on the Republicans nominating a very attractive nominee. Who would you like to see? What have you learned from the focus groups about that, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, the big one of the other things I tell people when I really want to depress them is that one of the big differences you see in the Republican groups and the Democratic groups is in the Republican groups, you say, all right, who do you want to see run in 2024? And a bunch of people say Trump. And then you say, okay, if Trump doesn't run, who do you want to see? And they're like, Ron DeSantis, Kristi Noem, Greg Abbott, Ted Cruz. And you may, they got tons of names of people that they like. And Ron DeSantis, the highest, he comes up all the time. Like, it is shocking to me how many people know who the governor of Florida is, people who live all over the country. That is unusual. You ask Democrats, who do you want to see run in 2024? You want Biden to run again? No. Who would you like to see? And there's just sort of a like, well, I don't know.
Well, let's just go through it. So there is a vice president. I mean, normally that would be the next one, but you don't find much enthusiasm. I
do not. And actually, the big thing about Kamala Harris that you hear, and you hear this about Biden too, the thing from the Democrats have been like, I don't see them. Where are they? Where is Kamala Harris? What is she even doing? People are like confused. There's a lot of people, certainly on the center right, swing voters, that do not like her. But for Democrats, they tend to just be sort of like bemused, like, or confused. Like, I don't know where she is or why she's not doing more. And I liked her. I was interested in her, but she's nowhere to be found. And so I think that is really, that's one piece of it. Yeah. It's interesting though. So I don't know what to say about that other than there are not voters who seem interested. Her name does not come up.
Yeah. And if Biden doesn't run, there'll be a huge field, but then people will emerge. Sure. I mean, I suppose that can fix itself in a way. But just on Biden, and you and I, we respect him, and we certainly supported him energetically in 2020. Don't you think the age thing is just a big problem? People are too polite sometimes to talk about it. I don't mean literally a problem in the sense that he's not capable of doing the job. I mean that people don't feel comfortable voting for someone who will be 82 for a 4-year term for president.
Yeah, people say it all the time. Democrats say it. You know, they are aware already that he would be closer to 90 at the end of his second term than to 80. And people just feel like that's not, like, we shouldn't do that. And people do like Biden, especially Democrats. And you're right about us. Like, I will tell you, having done so many of the focus groups, Biden was the only Democrat that was going to beat Donald Trump in that 2020 election. Like, he was exactly the right person to run. He has done the world and America a tremendous service. But the worst kinds of news that you can get from voters, if you're surveying them about yourself, is when they tell you that the thing that they don't like about you is something you can't change. Right? Like, when Jeb Bush found out that what people didn't like about him was that he was a dynastic Bush, like that was the main thing. Well, what are you going to do about that? And so for Biden, I think the thing is, though, is that, I think the Democrats need to take very seriously the notion that Donald Trump is going to run again. It's going to be the nominee. I could get into the DeSantis thing, but like,
you think Trump is more likely than anyone else to be the Republican nominee?
If he runs and if he wants it, look, and I'm not saying he's unbeatable. And Bill and I, in our eternal optimism that led us many years ago to think we could primary Donald Trump, one of the things that I remain committed to, that we believed early on, is that everything can change. Things that are true today do not have to stay true. And you can affect that change. You can be part of moving things, and you should try to move things. But I do think that hold on that Trump has on that base, that big, it depends on who gets in. But I do think that Trump has enough sort of hardcore loyalty where Trump is the only one they want to vote for, that he can get through a Republican primary if he runs and if he wants it. And also, I'm not sure who runs against him. He makes people look small. People are afraid. You're on DeSantis. You got to weigh the fact that a lot of people want you to get in. It's your moment. You watch Chris Christie miss his. You don't want to miss yours. But also, what happens when Trump lands on you like a ton of bricks? Like, does what happened to Marco Rubio happen to you? Does it break your political future? It's a risk. It's a risk. But I also think Biden is going to look at Donald Trump as the likely nominee and say, I was the only one that could beat him before, the only one that can beat him again. But we won't be in COVID times. for this next go round, and he won't be able to do it over Zoom. And so, these people have to decide if that's the right thing to do.
The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, really seems to want to run and is pretty gutsy in that way, I'd say, about politics. I wonder if he would even think about, start indicating he might want to run before Biden makes his decision. But does he ever come up in these groups, or people just don't know the other Democrats at this point?
He does not come up much, although I will tell you this. And this comes up with like Whitmer. Whitmer, who I think has a good chance of holding on because Tudor Dixon is an abortion extremist. But people who have hypocrisy around COVID is like one of those things that voters who were, and this means swing voters, center left voters, people who were told that they couldn't live their lives normally, but politicians who went and did something, people are not forgetting it. It is like a thing that they have held on to. It is the first thing people think of when they think of Gavin Newsom. If you talk about him, that's what comes up right away. If people even know who he is. So.
Yeah, COVID, has so many implications and effects on our country and society and politics in ways that one doesn't always process, right? It's very interesting what you say, because I hadn't really thought about it that way. Obviously, it's bad to be a hypocrite and to get caught out. But yeah, you're right. Maybe it's particularly galling if you were desperately trying to figure out how to handle your kids and your daycare and your job at home, and whatever, struggling, if you're middle class, working class, and like you had a huge amount of space perhaps and had to do all these things at home, and kid might have had special needs, and then suddenly he's telling you, nope, school's closed and I'm having a nice dinner. Yeah, you're right. It's the kind of thing that sticks, right? It's not like your normal, they all exaggerate, they all, whatever, go out to nice dinners with wealthy donors and stuff, but this is a little different, I guess, huh?
Yeah, can I just say a word about COVID just really quickly? It still looms over. So one of the reasons I think Democrats are doing better is I think that it has receded a great deal. But at some point, Democrats, and I forget when this was, but there were a bunch of stories about it at the time, and I was in a lot of them. They went and did after New Jersey. The election was very close to New Jersey, and they lost it in Virginia in those special elections. And they went and did a bunch of focus groups. They heard the same thing that I was hearing over and over again from swing voters and even from soft Democrats, which is they were enraged by the COVID restrictions. Like, people were done with them a long time before politicians realized they were done with them. And one of the reasons is that people in our income bracket work in jobs that could all have been done by Zoom. And so people were just like, they were fine, whatever. But if you were parents, if you were had to go somewhere, like people, the level of struggling that people were having, the frustration that they had with the COVID restrictions, it was such an element of where our politics were a year ago. And I think that the fact that it's now not as much is a big part too of what's not dragging Democrats down.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just think from like a sociological, cultural point of view, COVID will end up having changed a lot of things we haven't really thought that much. Everyone knows about work, remote work, and other kinds of aspects of this whole program we're on probably wouldn't exist but for COVID. When you used to fly out to, I remember going to LA and speak to 150 people, and it was fun, it was exciting and stuff. And now, frankly, you could still do it occasionally, but so much easier and cheaper and more effective and convenient for people to have 3,000 people on this live stream. It really is remarkable how much, I just think but that's an obvious thing, but I think in other more subtle ways, COVID will end up changing the way we sort of live and think. We have a couple of minutes. Final thoughts. You got a million questions we really haven't gotten to on particular candidates, obviously. Major from the Georgia Senate race. Will Trump be indicted? What would the effect of that be? We'll talk about that a bit since it's such a huge story. On the one hand, Trump's rallying everyone when he's a victim. On the other hand, I don't know, is it really good to, well, most Americans believe the whole FBI is corrupt and is willing to go execute a search warrant if there's not good reason, and is it good to have classified documents at Mar-a-Lago? I don't say a word about what you're finding about that.
Yeah, so here's the thing, and this story has been driving me crazy because literally nobody can extrapolate anything right now because we do not know what happened, right? Until we know he had the documents, we know he wasn't supposed to. Was he showing them to people? What does the FBI know? What was in the affidavit? At some point, we will find these things out. So in the very short term, I just was doing focus groups down in Florida. People are like, they're mad at the FBI. They think it was overkill, deep state. So he's having a little bit of rally round Trump effect. That's true. That is a blip. That's like ephemera that happens in a moment that you can see. But people who are like, this is definitely going to help him long term, we have no evidence of that. When Donald Trump is front and center with his legal troubles, that is not good for swing voters. That is the kind of thing that repels swing voters. And especially if there's criminality and all these Republicans defended him and he is charged, I have no idea if he'll be indicted or any of that. If he is, I will tell you this though, if he's not after January 6th and after this, if there's nothing, no sense of accountability, there will be a real backlash around people saying, well, clearly didn't do anything. It's just like Russia, total exoneration. And that will be bad because without actual consequences, Americans do get the sense that like they've been spun up and tuned up over nothing.
Yeah, and that's why I personally, this is worth what everyone here is paying for it. I mean, I just think the Attorney General would have thought that through. Once you do execute the search warrant, with the kind of search they did, there has to be a real genuine concern and worry about what documents are there and what they could be used for, even if they're not sure how they were being used or what the risks were in terms of national security. And B, he can think 2 steps ahead. And if you do all this, and then choose not to indict, it is like the Mueller thing, right? It becomes whatever the facts of it and however much they put out a report, like Mueller's saying, he did a lot of very bad things he shouldn't have done. At the end of the day, I think I do worry that swing voters look at that and think, well, they went after him again and they didn't get him again. Certainly his people will be supercharged. Whether swing voters get moved one way or the other, I don't know. But so that's another huge, what you said earlier, we should end with this, I suppose, a huge wild card out there. I mean, you said earlier, there are all these things have changed an awful lot, and unexpectedly so, right? In the last 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And they're not going to stop changing here in the next 2 months and the next 2 years. So, Sarah, you'll have to come back and explain all this to everyone. And not that it's my place to invite you, but I'm going to speak for them and thank you and for coming. Really, genuinely, that was interesting and fascinating and fun. And I hope I'm sure they'll have you back. And I should tell everyone, Janice and David have asked me to, of course, remind you just one more time that a week from now, Norm Eisen, a friend and a very lively fellow himself, will be on conversation with KPCC's Larry Mantle next Wednesday, August 31st at 5 p.m. Pacific. So thank you all for being there. Stay healthy, stay well, and I hope to join you all sometime soon. And I hope Sarah will join you all again sometime soon as well. Thanks again, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.